white officer stops a black judge at the courthouse, but what happens next is unbelievable. Leah Marshall was running late again as she pulled up in front of the New Orleans courthouse. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard of her sedan. 10 minutes until the trial started. Her heart pounded a little faster. This was the day she had been dreading yet had prepared for meticulously. Today was the opening day of a high-profile case that could change the way racial profiling was handled in Louisiana forever. Stepping out of her car, Leah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. As an accomplished black judge, she had navigated her fair share of adversity in the legal world, but the weight of this particular case hit differently. It wasn't just a case to her. It was personal. The defendant, a young black man named Kevin Daniels, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The officer who had detained him claimed he fit the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. Sounded familiar. Too familiar. Leah strode across the parking lot, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. Instead of using the grand entrance, she opted for a side door. The main steps of the courthouse were swarmed with reporters, their cameras poised and ready for the story of the day. She didn't have time for the media frenzy. As she approached the side door, she noticed a young white police officer standing guard. His stance was rigid, and his eyes followed her closely as she came nearer. Leah reached for the ID badge hanging from her neck, her usual routine before entering the building, but before she could even present it, the officer blocked her path. "I need to see some identification," he said, his tone sharp. Leah raised her eyebrows, taken aback. "I'm Judge Marshall," she said, lifting the badge higher for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." The officer didn't even glance at the badge. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned her up and down. Leah felt the familiar burn of anger rise in her chest, but kept her face calm. There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions," he continued, his voice laced with suspicion. Leah stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. The irony was suffocating. Here she was, about to oversee a trial about racial profiling, and she was being racially profiled at the courthouse doors. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel her pulse quickening, "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, willing him to just take one look and recognize his mistake. But the officer wasn't budging. His hand hovered over his belt, close to the handcuffs clipped to his waist. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You're going to need to come with me." Leah's breath hitched. This was escalating fast. She could see the look in his eyes, the kind of look she'd seen too many times growing up in the South. A mix of suspicion and contempt. It wasn't about her being a judge, it was about her being black. Before she could say anything else, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching. His face was a mix of surprise and concern. "Marshall?" His eyes widened as he recognized her. "Judge Marshall," he added. "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight. The older officer shot a glance at the younger one. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice firm. The younger officer, still fuming, took a reluctant step back. "He matches the description," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Heads the judge," the older officer snapped. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer mumbled something under his breath, finally backing off completely. Leah forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to stay calm. Losing her temper now would only play into the hands of someone like this. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the older officer asked, his voice softening. Leah nodded, though her jaw was clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she turned and walked into the courthouse. Her heart still raced. Inside, the familiar sterile halls welcomed her with the comfort of routine. But as she walked, the scene from outside replayed in her head on a loop. She had dealt with racism her entire life, but for it to happen like this on the day of this trial was almost too much. The courtroom quieted as Leah banged her gavel, calling the room to order. The trial began smoothly enough, with opening statements from both sides, but Leah's mind kept drifting back to the officer outside. His sneering face, the way he had judged her in an instant. It felt too close to the case she was now presiding over. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. Leah leaned forward slightly as he took the stand. His testimony was raw and painful. He described being stopped by the police for simply walking in his own neighborhood. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even been acting suspiciously, yet he was treated like a criminal, handcuffed and humiliated in front of his neighbors. Leah could feel the weight of his words as he spoke. She had heard stories like this before, countless times, but today it hit differently. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels. It was about the countless others like him, and it was about her. Halfway through the testimony, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Leah's heart sank. The young officer from earlier, the one who had stopped her, walked into the room. He made his way to the witness stand, his face pale and tense. Leah's eyes followed him, every nerve in her body on edge. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins to the stand." Bill Wilkins. Leah hadn't even caught his name before she watched him take the stand. His movements were stiff and awkward. She had to remind herself to remain impartial, to stay professional. But it was hard. This was the same man who had looked at her not as a judge, but as a suspect. Wilkins shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The prosecutor began questioning him, asking him to describe his role in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling the neighborhood when I saw Daniels," Wilkins began, his voice lacking the confidence he had shown earlier. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong there. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place. That phrase, she had heard it before, too many times. It was code for, "He was black, and I didn't think he should be there." The prosecutor pressed on, his tone sharp. "What exactly made Mr. Daniels look out of place, Officer Wilkins?" Bill fidgeted in his seat, his nervousness clear. He was acting nervous, looking around. It seemed like he was up to something. Leah felt the anger rising in her again. She had reviewed the case file. Daniels had been waiting for his rideshare. There was no crime, no suspicious behavior. He had simply been a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the eyes of the police. The prosecutor wasn't letting up. "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime?" Bill hesitated, his face flushing. No, he admitted. "We didn't." The room was silent for a moment. Leah could feel the tension building, thick and palpable. She glanced over at the jury, watching their reactions. Some were clearly moved, others seemed conflicted. But the truth was plain as day. Kevin Daniels had been arrested for nothing more than being black. Bill's testimony continued, his story unraveling with every question the prosecutor asked. Small inconsistencies began to appear, his version of events falling apart. Leah watched him closely, noticing how his eyes kept flickering toward her, filled with discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. When the prosecutor finally finished, Bill looked like a shell of the man who had tried to detain her outside the courthouse. Leah felt no pity for him, but she did feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one case. It was about a system that had allowed people like Bill to operate unchecked for too long. As the trial continued, Leah fought to keep her emotions in check. She had to remain neutral, had to ensure that justice was served, but it was hard. The parallels between her experience and the case in front of her were impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The defense attorney made his closing statements, trying to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had made an honest mistake. But Leah knew better, and so did the prosecutor, Samantha Green. The prosecutor rose for her final argument. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and powerful. "This case is not just about Kevin Daniels," she said. "It's about a pattern that we've seen too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how this assumption leads to wrongful arrests, humiliation, and injustice. And it's time to say enough." The courtroom was silent as Samantha's words sank in. Leah could feel the shift in the room. The jury was listening. They understood. When the trial finally came to a close, Leah dismissed the courtroom for the day, but she remained seated for a moment longer. Her mind was racing. She had done her job, had presided over the case fairly, but the encounter outside the courthouse still gnawed at her. It was a reminder that no matter her position, no matter her accomplishments, she would always be seen through the lens of her race. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, walked in. He approached the bench quietly, his face lined with concern. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah looked up, surprised. "Of course." Harris sighed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier with Wilkins. He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots like a lot of them do." Leah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots," she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You mean racism?" Harris winced but didn't argue. "Maybe, probably, but I want you to know I'm trying to fix it from the inside." Leah studied him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that real change was possible, but after everything she had seen, everything she had experienced, it was hard to hold on to that hope. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I'm sitting up here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand." Harris was silent for a long time before finally answering. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change." Leah nodded slowly, though the weight of the responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there would be more battles to fight. But for today at least she had taken a step forward. As Harris left the room, Leah glanced around the empty courtroom. She knew the fight was far from over, but today justice had been served, and that, she thought, was a start. The following morning, the air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. The jury had been deliberating all night, and today would bring their decision. Leah Marshall sat in her chambers, trying to center herself for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal moment. Not just in this case, but for many who had been watching closely. This trial was bigger than one man's wrongful arrest. It was about the fabric of justice and the biases sewn into it. Leah sipped her coffee, staring at the files spread across her desk. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of reporters and protesters gathering in front of the courthouse. This was more than a local story now. News outlets across the country had picked it up, and it had become a symbol for the systemic racism still plaguing law enforcement. Her mind wandered to the events of the previous day. Bill Wilkins, the officer who had profiled her, had sat in that courtroom clearly shaken, realizing his testimony could tear apart the very system he was part of. For all the courtroom's weighty silence, Leah had heard the subtle cracks in his voice, seen the tension in his face. Bill wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a flawed institution. And Leah knew that this case was about more than just making an example of one officer. It was about pushing a conversation that America had been avoiding for too long. She had a duty to deliver justice in this one case, but the weight of the responsibilities she felt was crushing. This trial symbolized a broader issue, the need to reform a system that allowed bias and profiling to become standard practice. There was a knock on the door, snapping her back to reality. "Come in," Leah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her clerk, Emily, entered, holding a folder. "The jury's ready." she said softly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair. She took a deep breath, smoothing her robe. "Let's do this." As she made her way to the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway. The courthouse felt different today. The tension wasn't just in the courtroom anymore, it was everywhere. Leah could feel it pressing in from all sides, an unspoken anxiety that everyone was carrying. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised, cameras ready. The families of both Kevin Daniels and Officer Wilkins were seated in the front rows, both groups tense and waiting. Leah took her place at the bench, glancing briefly at Kevin Daniels, who sat with his lawyer at the defense table. His face was somber, but there was a glint of hope in his eyes, a hope that justice would be served, that this trial might actually mean something. She shifted her gaze to Bill Wilkins. He looked far less sure of himself than the day before. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and for the first time since the trial began, he seemed small, like a man who had finally realized he couldn't outrun what he had done. Leah cleared her throat. "Please bring in the jury," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. The doors opened, and the 12 jurors filed in. Leah watched them carefully as they took their seats, trying to read their expressions, but their faces were unreadable, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, clutching it like a lifeline. Leah nodded toward her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded the piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray the gravity of the moment. "Please read the verdict," Leah instructed, her own heart pounding in her chest, though she kept her face composed. The forewoman glanced down at the paper before looking up again, her voice firming. "In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leah glanced at Kevin Daniels, who sat frozen. His face was blank for a moment before relief began to wash over him. His lawyer patted him on the back, and Kevin's eyes began to glisten, though he blinked away the tears. Leah then turned her gaze toward Bill Wilkins. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, his hands clenched tightly together. The weight of the verdict had clearly hit him, and for a moment it seemed as if he might break. She banged her gavel once. "Court is adjourned." But as the room began to stir with reporters scrambling for the exits and people filing out, Bill suddenly stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. Leah paused, looking down at him. The courtroom quieted again, all eyes turning to the young officer. He was visibly shaking now, his face pale as he struggled to find the words. I need to say." He swallowed hard, and his gaze fell to the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community. But I was wrong." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I see now that I let my assumptions, my prejudices, cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." The silence in the room was deafening. Leah felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an apology, yes, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo what had been done. She thought about all the times she had been in Kevin's shoes, stopped for nothing more than being black. And she knew this apology, though sincere, wouldn't erase those experiences. She met his eyes, her voice steady but firm. "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins, but the harm caused by your actions, by actions like yours, runs deep. It affects lives, families, and entire communities. Saying sorry doesn't fix that." Bill nodded, looking defeated. He didn't try to argue, didn't try to explain any further. He simply stood there, accepting the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, Leah saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. The courtroom slowly began to empty, and Leah remained seated for a moment, watching as Kevin Daniels hugged his family. His face was a mix of relief and exhaustion. Bill Wilkins stood quietly by the exit, waiting to be escorted out, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders. Leah's mind was racing. She had done her job, upheld the law, and presided fairly over this case. But it wasn't enough. This trial was just one drop in a much larger ocean of injustice. For every Kevin Daniels who received a semblance of justice, there were countless others whose stories would never be heard, whose cases would never make it to a courtroom. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened again, and Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, stepped in. Harris walked in. Leah looked up, surprised to see him. He approached her quietly, his face a mix of concern and something else. Something like hope. "Judge Marshall," he said softly, "can I have a word?" Leah nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course." Harris sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "I just wanted to say thank you." Leah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling this case the way you did," Harris replied. "For holding us accountable. We need that. The system needs that." Leah let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "I appreciate that, Sergeant, but it doesn't feel like enough. This was just one case. There are so many more out there, so many people who don't get justice." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, but that's why we have to keep pushing. It's not going to change overnight, but every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem." Leah was silent for a moment, thinking about his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that change was possible. But after everything she had seen, it was hard to keep that hope alive. "What about Wilkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to officers like him? Ones who've been taught to think a certain way?" Harris sighed. "I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. There are a lot of guys like him, but there are also people like me trying to change things from the inside, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can." Leah looked at him, seeing the weariness in his eyes but also the determination. It was the same determination she felt despite the setbacks, despite the frustrations. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge," Harris said. "That's how we change this, piece by piece." Leah nodded slowly. "Piece by piece," she echoed. As Harris left the room, Leah sat back in her chair, staring at the empty courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today they had taken one step forward, and that, she thought, was how change began. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, Leah Marshall remained seated at the bench. Her mind buzzed with the weight of what had just transpired, but it wasn't a victory she could savor. The trial was over, but its impact had just begun. For Leah, the fight for justice wasn't confined to this room. It stretched far beyond these walls, into communities still grappling with the same issues that brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. She stood up, gathering her files, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Kevin Daniels, approaching her with his attorney. His face was calm now, though the tension from the last few days had clearly worn him down. "Judge Marshall," Kevin said, his voice low but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Leah looked at him, pausing for a moment before responding. "You don't need to thank me, Kevin. I was just doing my job." Kevin shook his head. "No, it's more than that. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through. You gave me a voice." Leah's chest tightened. She understood what he meant and nodded. "I hope this is a step toward change," she said, her words carefully chosen. "But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go." Kevin's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, but it's a start, and for that I'm grateful." Leah watched him leave, his attorney close behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict, wasn't enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries. But she knew Kevin was right.